Canning 101, the science, history, and safety behind preserving your harvest. Canning is a really great way to preserve the harvest from your garden. There are two different types of canning, water bath and pressure canning. They're used for different types of food, and there are some really important reasons for that. Today, I'm going to cover the differences between water bath and pressure canning and the type of foods that can be canned with each type. I also want to cover the history and the science behind canning, both of which help inform us why we use the different types of canning for different foods, and show how important it is to be safe when canning. This is the first in a 4-part series all about the basics of canning. Check out my channel and my website for the next videos. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Chrissy Bernards, the owner of Moon and Hare Collective and Urban Farm here in Oregon. I'm an urban agriculture and homesteading educator, a curriculum developer, and a community herbalist. I grew up on a vegetable farm where I learned how to can and preserve food, eat seasonally, along with sewing and some other DIY skills. I ran away from the farming lifestyle as soon as I could, but after several years, I felt the pull back to growing food and traditional homemaking. I now use permaculture and regenerative growing methods on my urban homestead, where I teach about urban agriculture, food preservation, cooking on a budget, seasonal living, and other homesteading skills as a medium to introduce people to food systems and sustainability issues. I always love to know the science and history behind the techniques that we use to preserve food, so I understand the safety and reliability of the process. Then I will know which rules are okay to bend or even to break. So make sure you subscribe to my newsletter at the link in the description so you'll get notified when I put out more videos with valuable homesteading and homemaking information. Okay, let's dig in and get started. All right, here we have the two different types of canners, a pressure canner and a really big stock pot for water bath canning. Yes, you can use almost any pot that you have around for water bath canning. I'll get more into that in a future video. You can also use your pressure canner as a water bath canner if you want to save on space. So water bath canners work by submerging jars into this vat full of water and bringing it to a boil for the right amount of time. Pressure canning is done by locking the jars in the pot and raising the pressure inside with the heat for the correct amount of time. There is some water inside, just about a quart or two, which is used more like a signal to tell when all the air has been pushed out of the canner. Water bath canning is for high acid fruits like apples, strawberries, and the like. You can also add acid to some low acid foods, and then they can be water bath as well. Some examples of that are pickles, which use vinegar to raise the acid. And then pressure canning is for low acid produce like green beans and corn. You can also pressure can broths, meat, and dry beans. Okay, let's talk about the history of canning and why that's important to keep in mind for the safety of canning. Now, most homesteading activities started in the home and then were taken and commercialized to create the versions that you find in the grocery stores. Think about curing meat, baking bread, fermenting foods like sauerkraut and yogurt. These all started in the home and have been done for literal millennia. So we have a really long history of knowing which methods work and that they're safe. Canning, on the other hand, did not get its start in the home. Canning started as a commercialized process, and then a version was created for home canners. In 1795, Napoleon created a contest for preserving food in an economical manner that could be transported safely with his armies. In 1809, the award was won by a man named Nicholas Appert, who created the first canning process. But even he didn't understand how it worked. It would be more than 50 years later that Louis Pasteur discovered how canning kills and deactivates microorganisms that could otherwise make the food spoil. It wasn't until the 1880s that canning became available to the general public, and it wasn't until 1910 to about 1915 that canning was widely available. Really, the 1930s and 40s were the high point of canning. It's also important to note that while canning started gaining popularity around 1910, there were so many deaths and illnesses from botulism poisoning that in 1917, the USDA stated that low-acid foods should be pressure canned only. So why is all of this history stuff important? Well, those other household processes, baking bread, curing meat, fermenting yogurt, we literally have thousands of years of history knowing exactly what works, how they work, and how safe they are. And we don't have that with canning. Canning was invented before we knew how it works, and science and technology have had to catch up in order to explain how it works. We have less than 200 years of knowing how canning works, compared to literal millennia for other food preservation processes. In fact, since canning was invented as a commercial process first and then introduced to home canners, the science for home canning lags even farther behind because there just isn't the monetary enticement. In those big factories, they're using tin cans, not glass jars, and they're able to get foods to a higher temperature and higher pressure in those big industrial canners, which allows them to can things that home canners aren't able to. So in many canning groups, members often share stories about how their ancestors successfully water bath canned both low acid and high acid foods for generations and generations and generations. But canning just hasn't been accessible for as long as some people believe. It just hasn't been widely available for generations and generations and generations. Additionally, once it did become more widely available, experts quickly recommended using pressure canning for low acid foods due to its recognized safety benefits. So between the history of canning and the science behind it, I think you'll find it's just worth it to be safe when canning. Let's get into the science stuff next. Okay, let's get into how the canning process works. And how is water bath canning different than pressure canning? So canning is a two-part process, which includes killing and inhibiting the growth of microorganisms, namely the botulism virus and spores, and then sealing the jar to make sure that no more microorganisms can get in. Botulism has two forms, the bacteria or vegetative state and the spores. The bacteria is relatively easy to kill, and having food reach the temperature of boiling, which is 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees Celsius, for a certain amount of time will do it. The amount of time is dependent on the density of the food product. So sauces and jams take a shorter amount of time than something more dense like pickles or meat. However, the spores are much harder to kill. In water bath canning, we rely on the high acid environment inside the jar to keep the spores from growing. The acid is provided by the product itself, or vinegar, or sugar, or a combination of these things. Low acid foods actually create an ideal environment for the spores to grow. So in this case, we really want to make sure the botulism spores are deactivated. To do this, the food needs to reach a temperature of 250 degrees Fahrenheit or 121 degrees Celsius for 20 to 100 minutes, again, depending on the density of the food product. This can only happen in a pressure canner, where the pressure is raised, allowing the temperature inside the jars to get up to the right temperature. The density of the food matters because the temperature has to get to 250 degrees all the way to the center. So technically, you can still find some recipes out there for water bath canning low acid foods, but they have to be in the water bath for somewhere between 3 and 10 hours, during which time the water has to completely cover the jars. And if the water gets to the top of the jars, you have to add more. And every time you add more water, the boiling will stop. So you have to pause the timer until the water comes back to a rolling boil. So first of all, that just sounds like a big pain. 8 hours of standing over a boiling pot when the longest it takes to pressure can something is about 2 hours. And remember, you're cooking the produce in those jars as well. And cooking them for so long will just turn them to mush. It's really best to just use the safe recommendation. I'll get into the how-tos of pressure canning in future videos, but I promise it's not scary at all. Okay, the second part of canning is the sealing of the jars. In both pressure canning and water bath canning, when you remove the hot jars from the canner, the heat escaping the jars causes the lid to compress to the jar, and the rubber seal seals the goodness in and keeps the air and microorganisms out. Okay, once the jars come out of the canner, we want to place them on a towel on the counter or a table and let them just sit the way they are for 12 to 18 hours until they're completely cool. During this time, you may hear the lids popping as they seal. It gives you a little dopamine hit every time you hear it. Once the jars are completely cool, remove the rings and see if they're sealed by tapping on the lids. If the lid goes up and down, it didn't seal. Refrigerate that and eat within about a week or so. If it's a sauce, broth, or jam, or something that won't be harmed by being cooked longer, go ahead and reprocess if you like. Store the filled and sealed jars in a cool, dark place until you're ready to use them. Store them without the rings. Many times when microorganisms grow or if the food starts to ferment, it will make the lid pop open. And that's a really good way for you to know not to eat it. If you leave the ring on, it's more likely that it could reseal itself with heat fluctuations, which make it more likely that you might think it's okay to eat. And that's all there is to canning. Now, there are ways to play around with the amount of acid or rules that can be bent, but in general, I believe both the history and the process of canning shows that we should be using safe and approved methods. Especially, please don't mess around with canning until you have a lot of experience with safe methods under your belt. I'll provide links to some of the best websites and books with canning recipes in the post for this video. Make sure you head over to my website to take a look. So, canning is a great way to save your garden's harvest, blending science, history, and tradition. By learning the differences between water bath and pressure canning and understanding their backstory, you can make sure that your preservation efforts are both effective and safe. Stay tuned for the next video where I will dive into using a water bath canner. And I will keep adding more videos about homesteading and homemaking, so be sure to subscribe to my YouTube and to my newsletter in the link in the description so you will get all the fresh posts. I'll see you next time.